Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Greenbelt Foundation, welcome. Thank you particularly to our partners at York University Ecological Footprint Initiative. This has really been outstanding research collaboration on this important project. So also pleased to welcome our panelists who are bringing perspectives from science, conservation, and agriculture that are clearly essential to the future of the Greenbelt. Andrés Jiménez-Monge is Executive Director of Ontario Nature and a recognized leader in biodiversity, conservation, and environmental policy. Ontario Nature has long been at the forefront of protecting Ontario's natural heritage, making Andrés' perspective especially valuable as we discuss the ecological significance of the Greenbelt. A good friend of the Greenbelt Foundation, Mark Reusser, is a director with the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, among many hats that he wears. And he also farms in Waterloo region. He brings both practical farming experience and policy expertise, helping connect this research to the realities of protecting farmland while supporting a strong and productive agricultural sector. Together, our panelists represent the intersection of science, conservation, and agriculture. And that collaboration is exactly what is needed to sustain the Greenbelt for future generations. So we appreciate all of you for taking the time to join us today for the conversation. Really, the webinar today is more than a launch of a new report. It is about understanding of one of Ontario's greatest public assets and exploring new ways to measure, protect, and strengthen the benefits it provides to all Ontarians. So a little bit about the Greenbelt Foundation. The foundation worked to help ensure the Greenbelt has continued to deliver benefits for Ontario today and for future generations. We do this by investing in research, supporting innovative programs, providing grants, and bringing together partners from agriculture, conservation, municipalities, Indigenous communities, academia, and government. Our role includes helping to ensure that decisions about the Greenbelt are informed by strong evidence and the best available science. We see ourselves as both stewards and investors, stewards of one of the world's most significant protected landscapes, investors in community capacity, knowledge, partnerships, and practical solutions needed to keep the Greenbelt healthy, productive, and resilient. Ultimately, protecting the Greenbelt means protecting the natural and agricultural systems that provide clean water, healthy ecosystems, climate resilience, food production, and a high quality of life for millions of Ontarians. So a little bit about this report. Really, as the Greenbelt has reached its 20th anniversary recently, we started to think a bit about the future. The Greenbelt and its precursors, the Niagara Escarpment, the Oakers Moraine, were really about long-term forward-thinking public policy and what would matter to Ontario well into the future. So this is a report as part of our Visioning the Future of the Greenbelt series. It reflects the Foundation's commitment to looking beyond today's issues, which we do, but also asking what the Greenbelt will need to continue to deliver in terms of value over the coming decades. This report explores the major opportunities and challenges that will help shape Greenbelt's future while providing practical evidence-based insights, we hope, for governments, practitioners, and communities. So rather than looking at individual issues in isolation, the series asks bigger questions. What will Ontario need from the Greenbelt as our population grows? How do we strengthen its role in food security, water security, biodiversity, climate resilience, and economic prosperity? What evidence do decision makers need to make better long-term choices? This latest report introduces an important new lens, biocapacity. It helps us move beyond simply measuring how much land is protected to understanding what the land actually produces and sustains. It provides a clearer picture of how the Greenbelt supports food production, clean water, biodiversity, carbon storage, and the long-term sustainability of our province. And hopefully, just as importantly, it gives governments, municipalities, and practitioners another practical tool to support evidence-based planning and investment. So we hope this report stimulates discussion, informs policy, and helps strengthen generations to come.
Hi, everyone. My name is Peri Dworatzek, and on behalf of the team at York University, we are pleased to present this research that for the first time ever, we derived biocapacity data for Ontario's Greenbelt. Our team has expertise in generating ecological footprint and biocapacity on a planetary basis, as well as on a national basis, also a provincial scale, a municipal scale, and even down to the household level, which can be generated using ecological footprint calculators. And so the research that we are presenting on today drew from some of our prior ecological footprint and biocapacity data and research that we generated at other scales. So for instance, we included data from the National Ecological Footprint and Biocapacity accounts. As well, we also engaged with statistics on the amount of food that was grown in Ontario versus the amount that is grown and harvested from the rest of Canada. So with that brief introduction about who we are and what we do, let's turn to some of the biocapacity data for Ontario's Greenbelt. So here we have a map that most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. So it's a piece of southern Ontario, stretching from Lake Ontario up to Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. And so it's the part of southern Ontario that contains the Greenbelt being outlined in the black. The Greenbelt is a protected area of agricultural lands, forest lands, aquatic areas, and other natural heritage areas. And so what we can ask, what does this land cover look like in the Greenbelt when it's spatially mapped? So each color on that land cover map represents a different land cover category that is based on the biocapacity components. And so the first category, which is difficult to see on the map because there is so little of it, is what we call low biocapacity. And so these areas, these land cover areas are not classified within the other biocapacity components because they were deemed to have little ecological productivity. And so examples of these include barren lands, dunes, and other unidentified clearings. But it's really a small part of the Greenbelt land area. It only represents 2% of total area in the Greenbelt. The next land cover category is shown in the orange, cropland. And so these are agricultural fields managed as row crops, orchards, or vineyards, and they have the capacity to yield food and fiber crops that are consumed by humans, or they can be fed to animals and fish. And so you'll see on that left-hand side, we can also start to visualize the quantity of cropland being measured in hectares in HA. And so in the Greenbelt, there are 180,000 hectares of cropland, approximately 22% of the Greenbelt's land cover. The next category, land cover category, is built up land. And this is land occupied by transportation infrastructure, brownfields, buildings such as residential or commercial buildings, urban recreational areas, as well as green spaces like lawns and parks. And so there are approximately 81,000 hectares of built up land in Ontario's Greenbelt, which amounts to about 10%. There's also a lot of forests in the Greenbelt, around 229,000 hectares, or 28% roughly of the total area. And this includes treed areas with the capacity to be harvested for timber products and pulp and firewood. Or if they're not harvested, then they're counted as sequestering carbon emissions. And so there's also a similar amount of pastures, around 224,000 hectares of pastures, which is defined as meadows, shrublands, and agricultural fields that are managed for hay or grazing and have some capacity to be grazed by livestock to supplement the feed that's provided by the cropland component. And then we have our wetlands component as well. And so this is area of marshes, fens, bogs, and swamps, which have the capacity to sequester carbon emissions. And this amounts to roughly 9% of the Greenbelt, or 72,000 hectares. And then finally, the last component is the aquatic areas. So open freshwater bodies of water that are deeper than 2 meters, and they can support fish, invertebrates, and other aquatic plants. And this represents a small portion of the Greenbelt, about only 2% or 18,000 hectares. And so this visualization of the map, the geospatial visualization, but also the stacked bar graph here, was made using Ontario land cover that's available on Ontario GeoHub. And so if you are familiar with this data set, you've probably noticed that OLC has a lot more land cover categories than what are shown on the screen. And so what we've done is taken the total land categories and aggregated them into these biocapacity components to represent land cover. So for instance, forests includes hedgerows, as well as different types of forest, deciduous, coniferous forests, and so on. The wetlands component includes fens, bogs, and swamps, all aggregated together into these more simplified components that represent biocapacity. So this figure presents the quantity of land cover, the amount of land within each of these components, but we can also show the quality of each of these land components as represented by biocapacity. Biocapacity is the ability of ecosystems to supply the natural resources that humans consume and absorb the waste that we produce. Biocapacity is measured in a unit called global hectares, which is represented by the GHA at the bottom of the second column. Global hectares are a globally standardized and equivalent unit that's created by converting Ontario biological yield to an equivalent world average biological yield, and then another equivalence of the world average hectare of biologically productive area. And so what this graph on the left makes clear is that there are more global hectares than hectares in the Greenbelt. In 2020, there was 800,000 hectares of land and water in the Greenbelt, which amounted to 2.2 million global hectares of biocapacity. So Ontario's Greenbelt provides almost 3 times the amount of biocapacity per hectare of land. And specifically, you can tell from this graph, it's the cropland component that has the most ecological value in terms of biocapacity. In every hectare of cropland in the Greenbelt, there are 8 global hectares of biocapacity. And if we are to compare that to other cropland around the world, for every 1 hectare of cropland in the world, there are only 3 global hectares of biocapacity. So this comparison quantifies the significance of the Greenbelt's ecological value, but we can also use biocapacity data to understand the relationship between consumption and the land. And so that's one reason why global hectares as a unit is valuable, because we can use global hectares to make comparisons. We can compare biocapacity of one area to another area, but we can also compare it within different years as well. And we can compare biocapacity to ecological footprint. So ecological footprint measures the amount of biocapacity that's needed to support consumption that took place within a geographic area within 1 year. And so we measured Ontario's ecological footprint from a prior project, so we can use that, so we can compare that to the Greenbelt's biocapacity. Ontario's ecological footprint is represented in this tree graph here to the left, where each inside rectangle represents a proportional amount of that component out of the total ecological footprint. That's the total, the sort of outer rectangle. And so the total ecological footprint in Ontario is 106 million global hectares. And you can see that the carbon uptake component, or you can refer to it as the carbon component, carbon footprint, that represents the largest portion of the ecological footprint, followed by the cropland and then forest products and so on. And so these ecological footprint components correspond to the biocapacity components, with the one exception that the carbon uptake component represents the carbon that is absorbed by forest lands and wetlands in the biocapacity side. And so we can compare Ontario's ecological footprint to the Greenbelt's biocapacity, which is spatially represented on the slide here in that top left corner. And so even though Greenbelt biocapacity is smaller than Ontario's ecological footprint, what this visual does is it highlights the relationship and how significant it is, considering the Greenbelt is not a huge piece of the total area of Ontario. Measuring the Greenbelt's biocapacity and comparing it to Ontario's ecological footprint is valuable because it helps us to understand how the Greenbelt supports Ontarians' consumption, the role the Greenbelt plays in Ontario's trade of food and forest products, and how the Greenbelt can support managing Ontario's carbon budget. But it's also valuable to compare Ontario's ecological footprint to the actual area of land that's within Greenbelt boundaries.
So although the Greenbelt makes up only 0.7% of Ontario's total land area, it provides enough biocapacity to support 2.1% of Ontario's entire ecological footprint. In other words, it contributes disproportionately more than its size alone would suggest. Looking at individual land types, pasture land is especially significant, with the Greenbelt grazing lands providing nearly 193,000 global hectares of biocapacity. This is enough to support about 17% of Ontario's grazing land ecological footprint. Cropland is another major contributor since it provides a biocapacity equivalent of 9% of Ontario's cropland ecological footprint. And these findings here demonstrate that the Greenbelt is more than just a protected area. It plays a key role in supporting food production and the biocapacity that helps Ontario to meet resource demands and support the province's ecological footprint. This map here shows the geographic distribution of the Greenbelt across Ontario's census subdivisions, which correspond to municipalities as are defined by these borders and their labels. Rather than looking at the Greenbelt as one continuous area, this approach allows us to examine how biocapacity is distributed at a much smaller and finer spatial scale. Each municipality contains different combinations of forests, cropland, pasture, wetlands, and other productive land types. So their contributions to biocapacity vary considerably from municipality to municipality. Analyzing the Greenbelt at this level helps to identify which municipalities contribute the most biocapacity and also provides information that supports local land use planning and decision making. While the Greenbelt spans 63 municipalities, its biocapacity is not evenly distributed, as I mentioned. In fact, about half of the Greenbelt's total biocapacity is found within just 7 municipalities, as you can see in the box on the screen. These include Hamilton, Scugog, Clarington, Caledon, Brock, Uxbridge, and King. The city of Hamilton contributes the largest share, providing approximately 340,000 global hectares of biocapacity from about 88,000 hectares of Greenbelt land. This represents about 15% of the Greenbelt's total biocapacity. This figure also compares each municipality's Greenbelt area with the amount of biocapacity it provides. Municipalities with similar land areas don't necessarily produce the same amount of biocapacity because their land cover differs from place to place. For example, Niagara-on-the-Lake has the highest biocapacity to area ratio among these top 10 municipalities, and it's largely because a greater proportion of its Greenbelt land is highly productive cropland. So up to this point, we focused on the Greenbelt itself, but this slide here expands this perspective by looking at the communities that are close enough to benefit directly from its agricultural productivity, but also those that are far away who also benefit. So we created a 100-kilometer buffer, local food buffer, around the Greenbelt to approximate the typical distance that locally produced food would take to travel from farm to consumer. And while it's not a perfect measure of distribution, it provides a really useful way where we can examine the Greenbelt's regional significance. As you can see, the buffer extends well beyond the 63 Greenbelt municipalities, and it encompasses 237 municipalities across southern Ontario, including a lot of the Greater Golden Horseshoe. This shows you that the benefits of the Greenbelt extend far beyond its boundaries. The cropland and pasture that is within the Greenbelt helps to support local food production for millions of Ontarians, including many people who do not live within the Greenbelt's boundaries and within their municipalities.
Now, speaking of cropland, biocapacity is also a really great tool to track gains and losses in important land uses like farmland within Ontario's Greenbelt. And so, in addition to biocapacity data for the year 2020, we were also able to use the 2015 Ontario Land Cover OLC raster layer to determine gains and losses in biocapacity within that 5-year time period. And this data is also disaggregated by the 6 components of biocapacity, as well as each of the Greenbelt municipalities. And to investigate changes in cropland capacity, we've highlighted 10 municipalities with the greatest losses in cropland between 2015 and 2020, the most significant being the municipality of Clarington, with a decline in over 2,300 global hectares of cropland biocapacity. And what's particularly interesting to note here when we look at corresponding gains in biocapacity for these same municipalities, it's how notable losses in cropland consistently coincide with a very measurable gain in built-up land, which might potentially indicate that the pressures of urbanization are really actively reshaping our land use, and that growth might be occurring at the expense of our broader agricultural capacity. When we look at the changes in the context of the Greenbelt as a whole, and in terms of land area and hectares, we're also observing these same patterns, with losses concentrated in cropland as well as pasture land, and gains really being focused in on built-up land or lands considered low biocapacity in purple there. In our report, we also differentiate between the inner and outer boundary of the Greenbelt, with the inner boundary being characterized as any Greenbelt municipalities which directly border Lake Ontario, and outer boundary being those that don't. And the inner boundary municipalities tend to be more built up as well as populated, especially the city of Toronto, and the outer boundary municipalities being less so. And about 48% of Greenbelt biocapacity exists within the inner boundary municipalities, totaling 1.08 million global hectares, compared to 1.18 million global hectares for those outer boundary municipalities in total. And although the inner boundary municipalities are typically more urbanized and contain these large, built-up large metropolitan areas, they still evidently hold these a very significant share of the Greenbelt's biocapacity. And this really reminds us that these important ecological areas and assets are not only found in more rural landscapes, and that even in more developed areas, protected land continues to provide very critical ecological value, which is why maintaining and strengthening protection in these municipalities is just as important as it is in those more rural parts of the Greenbelt. And overall, these findings are discussed in our report, and collectively they can really be applied towards building a more clear vision for the future of the Greenbelt.
And so our research report concludes with several recommendations, which our research team offered to guide the future of the Greenbelt so it can continue to benefit Ontarians. And so in the report, you'll see, as we show here, a series of recommendations that we offer. This includes, for example, the prioritization of collecting and reporting data on land cover and land use. And you'll notice already, as has been discussed in our research, that we had to rely on a year 2020 snapshot of the hectares of the landscapes from the official provincial inventory. We were told that a 2025 update will be available at some point in the future. But of course, considering the pace of changes in Southern Ontario, I'm sure that we'll all agree that we'll need to reduce that lag. Nevertheless, the data that we generated in this report and through the shape files and so on that go into this report behind the scenes, this can all be very useful to be of use to municipalities, to conservation authorities, to stewardship councils and other related organizations to, let's say, apply the metrics and the coefficients that we generated in this research to potentially more updated and local inventories of changes in the hectares of land cover and land use in your part of the Greenbelt or your part of Ontario. Our recommendations also speak to making the data available, which the Greenbelt Foundation can and will do. Our second to last recommendation, which we highlight here, is to explore ways of incorporating biocapacity into municipal natural asset management inventories and frameworks. So there's a growing interest in what can be broadly defined here as natural asset accounting, which is sometimes called natural asset valuation, which we've just profiled on the left side here of the slide. Natural asset accounting is about measuring the capacity of natural living systems and their components to provide benefits used by humans over time. Now, fortunately, it's easier than ever before to do this with more and more information and expertise, although unfortunately, it's still not commonplace. Municipalities and the province and our national government, through Statistics Canada, put a lot of effort into accounting for built assets and financial assets, but with too little effort put into natural asset accounting. So it is still at the forefront of accounting, and it requires, and I would say this, of course, as a researcher and academic at your university, it requires our deliberate activism to accelerate the progress on this, because it's not happening otherwise at the pace that is appropriate, given the sort of challenges with us now and into the future related to sustainability, climate, etc. Now, there are lots of signals, though, by governments to do better in the future about this. For example, the new Canada Nature Strategy identifies the importance of natural asset accounting and valuation, and many municipalities in Ontario are signaling their intention, and many have already taken action to include natural asset accounting, even if some of the language and the framing and how it fits in may or may not be positioned explicitly as such. And I'll just identify too, especially potentially with some of the attendees of this webinar or of its recording, that natural asset accounting has been supported by a great number of people, of experts, advocates, and initiatives in Ontario and abroad, including, for example, the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, which includes prior collaborations through the Natural Capital Lab, and also prior non-governmental initiatives, including, for example, Green Infrastructure Ontario and the Ontario Network on Ecosystem Services. And I'll just add a little bit more context than what we had written in the report, that as someone who has been involved with this topic for many decades, I'll emphasize that natural asset accounting should appreciate that there are many potential metrics of value which can be included in natural asset accounting. So please don't assume that the only metric of value worth accounting is monetary equivalence. Units of account relate to the questions being asked, who is asking for it, for what purposes, and within what frameworks. The value add of including biocapacity, measured in global hectares, in natural asset accounts is that it relates to geography and its constraints and trade-offs. And this is especially important in the Southern Ontario context, with great pressures and conflicts relating to land use. The other value add, and potentially the most important value add of including biocapacity in natural asset accounts, is that it relates the supply of natural assets and their capacity to human needs and uses of geography as measured by ecological footprint. Now, the significance of biocapacity and its relationship to ecological footprint is identified in Ontario's biodiversity strategy, and both are measured in the State of Ontario's biodiversity reporting system, which the public can access. Globally, ecological footprint and biocapacity are included in the coming Montreal Framework for Biodiversity Conservation, globally through the Convention on Biological Diversity. And these are tracked by the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Now, the one final recommendation, just to note and highlight here, is the next one, which we've got highlighted here by the red box, which is to establish a provincial Greenbelt biocapacity target of at least 0.15 global hectares per Ontarian. We have a paragraph sort of relating to this in the report, just to emphasize that as we think about the amount of this great natural asset that we have protected through the Greenbelt per Ontarian, with a growing number of Ontarians and growing amount of consumption in Ontario as well, they should challenge us to think about how to ensure that the quantity of this great natural asset of the Greenbelt does not diminish over time. And that's a bit more into the question of the future, which can be part of the discussion after this presentation and certainly beyond. But we'll just sort of conclude with questions of what would that be in 2030? How many global hectares of biocapacity could there be, should there be, shall there be by 2050? These are important questions to consider. And the research that we provided in this report can certainly be used to explore scenarios of the future. And even though, of course, when we're telling these things up, a number like 1.15 global hectares of biocapacity might seem like a small number. That, of course, in metric is 1,500 square meters of Greenbelt biocapacity. And so to turn our attention to both the present and the future and understanding this in a broader context, we'll conclude our presentation of the research results and now turn to a panel discussion with panel perspectives. We're going to hear from 3 people on perspectives on this research and its context. First, we will hear from Mark Reusser, who is the Zone 9 Director and also on the Ontario Federation of Agriculture Board. Following Mark's reflections, we will hear from Andrés Jiménez-Monge, who is the Executive Director of Ontario Nature. And following Andrés, we will hear from Edward McDonnell again, who is the CEO of the Greenbelt Foundation. And so with that, at this point, then I'll turn it over to you, Mark, to share your perspectives, reflecting on some of the key takeaways from this report from the agricultural sector's perspective, and how might this information be used to support farmland protection, and with your other lived experiences of engaging with the Greenbelt over these many years as a farmer.
First, a little bit of background. I farm in Waterloo region, which is just to the west of the Greenbelt, and a very small little section of Waterloo region actually is in the Greenbelt, but it's only a couple hundred acres. So back when the Greenbelt was first formed, Waterloo region actually asked the government of Ontario to include all of the non-urban portion of Waterloo region in the Greenbelt, and we were denied. So I just wanted everyone to know that as background before I begin. So I want to say a few words about the model itself. I like models. Models are useful. Sometimes they need a little bit of interpretation. And with regard to the Greenbelt, models tend to look at uniformity. And the Greenbelt is an incredibly diverse place. And it has 2 very important and special regions in it. One is the tender fruit area in Niagara region. The other is the Holland Marsh region. These are incredibly special places, and I suspect that the biocapacity in each of those 2 places is much higher than the rest of the Greenbelt, and probably in many places in the rest of Ontario. And of course, to a lesser extent, there's the apple growing region in the Durham region. My point is that when looking at this model, take into account that the Greenbelt is not uniform. It's got all different kinds of places in it with different biocapacities. And I would suggest that even some of them, like the rock face of the escarpment, probably a lesser biocapacity, especially with respect to agriculture. One stat that you have come up with here I found especially interesting, and that is how an acre of Ontario cropland is equivalent to 5.9 global hectares. Sorry, I said acre. 1 hectare of Ontario cropland is equal to 5.9 hectares of global hectares, excuse me. That's an astounding statistic. And excuse me, I think that it is something that can be used everywhere in Ontario. And I'll make a comment about it, and I use this all the time. We live in an incredibly special place here in southwestern Ontario. We have this wonderful combination of a relatively benign climate, moderated by 3 Great Lakes, a huge range of soil types within the Greenbelt and outside the Greenbelt. We can grow a longer list of fruits, grains, vegetables, and livestock than anywhere else in North America, with the exception of California. This is a special place, and the Greenbelt is part of that. And most people don't know that. They don't recognize it. They look at it as a place to grow cities, which it can, but don't forget agriculture, and don't forget the astounding amount of biocapacity that is here. Sometimes Greenbelt, sometimes models can be a little bit deceptive too. Biocapacity in the Greenbelt is 3 times higher when compared to the rest of Ontario. The reason for that is most of the rest of Ontario is wilderness. So it's a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison. That's not a criticism of the model. It's simply, again, interpretation. If you give me a little bit of a leeway here, Eric, I'm going to make some comments that reflect on biocapacity, but in a different way. One of the issues the Greenbelt has produced is some leapfrogging. In other words, urbanization occurs just on the outside of the Greenbelt. And how does that affect biocapacity? Well, what happens is that biocapacity is not affected by urbanization outside the Greenbelt, but it is affected just outside the Greenbelt. And I think that needs to be recognized because sometimes the land just outside the Greenbelt can be as good as or better than the biocapacity inside the Greenbelt. Just needs to be recognized. Another comment about the Greenbelt is that perhaps it's not enough to have biocapacity. You also need to have agriculture that's profitable. Because without it being profitable, you can't monetize that biocapacity, and it is sometimes a sore point with farmers. And I think that zoning, bylaws, regulations all need to be agricultural friendly. We can't let the biocapacity in the Greenbelt be harnessed by it being a home and exclusive playground for the rich. It needs to be a working landscape where biocapacity is monetized. And another word about that too, one of the most, I think, important features of the Greenbelt is its proximity to 8 million people in the GTA. And a way to monetize that biocapacity is to allow on-farm diversified uses that are somewhat different than those that you typically find in the rest of Ontario. We monetize biocapacity in the rest of Ontario through traditional agriculture. There's an opportunity in the Greenbelt to do things a little bit differently and take advantage of that proximity to all those people. So things like value added, on-farm processing, farm gate sales, pick your own operations, farm entertainment, farm tourism, and farm events allow agriculture to be profitable in a place like the Greenbelt where they might otherwise not be. And I'm not going to say that's the most important thing to remember, but it's an important thing to remember when you want to protect biocapacity and you want to protect the landscape and everything that's in it in the Greenbelt. So that's a little bit of an agricultural perspective on it.
Great. Thanks, Mark, for sharing that. And now let's hear from Andrés. Over to you.
Yes, I'm going to start with thank you. Being here with all of you, Eric, who I took classes from, Mark, who I've managed to share a spot in the Ontario Biodiversity Council, and then Ed. I was reading a 2005 Ontario Nature magazine that said Ontario's Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, John Gerritsen, has appointed Ontario Nature's Linda Pym, Acting Director of Conservation, to the Greenbelt Council. The 9-member council, which representatives from sectors having an interest in the Golden Shoe Greenbelt plan, will monitor implementation of the plan, identify emerging issues, and advise on performance measures to track how well the plan is achieving its goals. And it connects the Niagara Escarpment Commission at the time, the Oak Ridges Moraine Foundation, and as it says, the new Greenbelt Foundation. And it's because Ontario Nature was a seminal part of the Greenbelt, and it is so happy to be here assessing the performance of the Greenbelt and bringing new recommendations. And also thank you to the students and the researchers that were able to create this. The first thing I want to say is I am so happy that the Greenbelt exists, because right now we see the results of the dreamers that dreamt about the Greenbelt. It is very important for us to acknowledge what I just read. There was a whole bunch of dreamers that dreamt about the Greenbelt, brought this dream to decision makers and connected with multiple organizations, and then it came to happen. And 21 years later, we're here enjoying the benefits of this Greenbelt. And as Mark said, are we all enjoying them equally? No, we are not. But it is very important that it is there thanks to that work. And I'm going to first connect with a piece that Mark said on recreation. This measure of accounting does not specifically assess recreation. And people who care about the Greenbelt may not understand biocapacity, but they will understand joy. And driving through the hills and wetlands to a cottage, walking a trail with the dog, photographing sunflower farms, as Mark was so suitably saying, with birds, the quiet of home, the pleasure of a drive, all of this happens thanks to the Greenbelt, and it is a gift for the 8 million people that live around it. I've come to understand after 10 winters of being here that Ontarians work hard all week, and on the weekend they embrace the nature people within them. They go birding, they go skiing, they go doing outdoor activities, fishing, swimming. And without the Greenbelt, so many of these would either be really, really far or would be simply not accessible. And it is all thanks to this associated spaces. I managed to discover an endangered species of salamander in the Greenbelt, thanks for it being there and for it protecting those spaces. And then it makes me think about municipalities. There are 5 municipalities with outsized opportunity and responsibility here when it comes to the Greenbelt. But all of them, as Mark was so suitably saying, even those that are around the Greenbelt, can do something to support the Greenbelt. And I have a question for them and all of the ones that are here on the chat. How can they use this information? Because a goal could be to adopt biocapacity as a decision-making tool, one that helps them talk with residents and visitors, and using it as what I was just reading, one of the performance measures that could be used for the Greenbelt. And also, one key way of supporting the Greenbelt within your municipalities is building the local support with the farmers, outdoors people, and nature stewards that can help keep this biocapacity in its different forms. We haven't really addressed how do you grow biocapacity. And we tend to think the biocapacity is a measure that is there, right? We have this biocapacity for this year, but biocapacity gets consumed, but it also regenerates every year. And so can we help regenerate that biocapacity is one of the questions. And it's one of the questions that I constantly try to answer, because my life is about understanding what are the possible ways for us to protect different lands in different ways, from working landscapes to protected areas. And the fact is that dichotomy that gets put in front of us, economy or the environment, gets completely destroyed when you look at the Greenbelt. The Greenbelt represents the idea that economy and nature can live together, have lived together, and are extremely productive. And so every time I hear that, I just look at the Greenbelt and I say, well, that's not the case. And what are the policies that we need to embrace within the Greenbelt for that economy to be even further boost, that are in tune with keeping the biocapacity of the Greenbelt? Which makes me think, how do we dream the Greenbelt again? And I've come to think about 2 ways. I was sitting in London in a meeting about 6 months ago, and one of the dreamers, came with a map that kind of created a connection between Windsor to the Greenbelt, and was like, at some point someone had a map about the Greenbelt, and I've seen that. It used to be called the Greenway, and then it started connected with the Oak Ridges Moraine and with the Niagara Escarpment. And then I started thinking, well, how do we expand the Greenbelt? And I thought of 2 ways. One, of course, is what Mark was referring to, and I was reading an Ontario Nature magazine article of how it was tried to be expanded in Waterloo some time ago, 2008, I believe. And so there's the physical expansion of it. For example, connecting Windsor to the Greenbelt or connecting Georgian Bay to the Greenbelt would seem like such obvious ways to move. But another one which is the least common of them, is expanding the rules and guidance learnings that we've had from the Greenbelt to other parts that are not the Greenbelt. What are the rules on the Greenbelt that contributed to our well-being and joy now? And this is one of those ways. And so I made an exercise yesterday from this report and was like, so what are like the top 3 rules and guidelines that the Greenbelt plan has that has actually made it been such a joyful place? One of them, I think, is the settlement area boundary freeze, right? Inside the Greenbelt, towns, as Mark was saying, are limited from expanding their borders to build new subdivisions of farmland. The boundary is fixed. And so to grow that town, it's harder than in other places outside of the Greenbelt. And why does it work? Well, building outward means new roads, new pipes, and fire stations that not only will have an effect on the biocapacity, but that taxpayers will fund for decades. Well, land inside those boundaries sits half-used, that has not really been used and has not been deployed for those purposes. And those freezes force efficient growth instead of sprawl paid by all of us. A second one is thinking about water resource system protection. So inside the Greenbelt, as I understand it, you can't drain or build over wetlands and headwater areas without approval from the engineers that actually manage those watersheds. And why does it work? Where wetlands soak up flood water for free. Destroy one and the town has to rebuild that flood protection with concrete pumps, and homeowners downstream still pay for flood damage and rising insurance when it isn't enough. And so keeping the wetland is the cheaper option. And then the third policy, which is one of those lessons from the Greenbelt, is the natural heritage system connectivity mapping. Protecting a single patch of forest or wetland isn't enough. The plan requires natural areas to be connected by mapped corridors, and any new development nearby has to prove it won't cut that connection, not just that it avoids the patch. And why does it work? An isolated patch surrounded by pavement slowly dies off. Species can move, breed, or recover from a bad year. A connected system works as one piece of infrastructure, the same way a road network only works if the road connects. And so if we start thinking about this with province-wide implications, and if we start thinking that municipalities could map and should map their natural areas as connected systems, not a checklist of protected spots, that means that any nearby development has to pass the connectivity test before approval. And these are some of the lessons that at least I draw from the successful experiment at some point and now history of success that the Greenbelt is.
Great. Thank you, Andrés. And next, we'll turn to Edward McDonnell to reflect on how the research fits with another work that the Greenbelt Foundation is doing. Over to you, Ed.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks, others, for the comments. So maybe before I talk about the current work, I'll just remind people that the Greenbelt was originally established, and much like this report was looking at the connection between natural systems, all the things we love and care about, but also growth. And it was really very much sort of tied to the idea of managed growth in the most complicated, populated area in the entire country. 1 in 4 Canadians live in and around the Greenbelt region. About 25% of our national GDP is generated in this area. It's incredible. Like, as we've highlighted, it's a relatively small proportion of the province, but it has this immensely complicated but really valuable systems, economic value, etc. So Greenbelt was always meant to be understood as, how do we have protected areas? How do we have really important ecological, agricultural, water systems, even as we have growth and we have a high degree of urbanization? So this report is another lens on that interrelationship between how do we keep an eye on, the impact of human beings and the way we live, but at the same time think about how we invest in and understand the importance of natural systems and ecological benefits. So just a reminder of history, there's 20 plus years of sort of thinking about this connection between human communities and the landscapes around us. To Mark's point, you can have that. The Greenbelt is a working landscape. We just, it's not a nature reserve like alone. We did a recent update on some economic impact numbers with Ernst & Young, And that indicated there's just on industries and sectors that are Greenbelt dependent, there's $17 billion of contribution to provincial GDP. There's about 224,000 people whose jobs are dependent on the Greenbelt and the nature of the Greenbelt. So what we see is we can have this ecologically significant, agriculturally significant, hydrologically significant area that also provides economic benefits and a vibrant sort of set of rural economies, etc. So this is really the magic of this, is as we continue to think about the fact that we can have both of these things. There's a lot of talk about further growth, and we've seen a lot of growth in Southern Ontario, extraordinary growth. But that growth can occur and needs to occur in conjunction with continuing to get the most out of the Greenbelt, because as we have more people, we need more water, or we need to manage the water resources ever more carefully. We need more food, more recreational opportunities, and all the clean air and other benefits. So it's not one or the other here, which I think sometimes feel like it's a zero-sum game. It's in fact, this is the beauty of the whole exercise, and what your report is really highlighting is this, like, and the more we can understand the connections, and then when we think about investing in strengthening the values and how do we get even more biocapacity benefits, for example. And in our work, I'd maybe offer a few examples. So in the agricultural space, we have a very large soil health program working with farmers all across the Greenbelt on new best management practices tied to soil type. I won't bore you with all the details, but we've seen really incredible benefits from this, and it's a way of sort of increasing, the ecological capacity, etc., while also, providing farmers with benefits like greater protection to storm events, increased yield due to healthier soils. So that's one example. For municipalities, we have a large natural asset management program, which helps them formalize the ways in which they're valuing natural assets, which produce lots of ecosystem service benefits like, water filtration, stormwater management, lots of things, and avoid a cost related to engineered infrastructure that would otherwise be required. So for municipalities, is a really interesting opportunity to further advance how they manage natural assets, much like they would any asset within their portfolio. And then the last thing maybe I'll mention is our 1 million tree program, where we've taken a very purposeful look at getting the right tree in the right place for the right reason. It's actually pretty hard in a near urban environment to plant trees effectively, and especially, but what we've been working with partners like Forest Canada on is how do you actually plant in ways that reforest to increase benefits like climate resilience, biodiversity, greater resilience to storm events again. So there's lots of ways we can approach this idea of enriching what already exists in smart ways. And I think the kind of research you're highlighting, and to the extent to which it's broken down by municipalities, it helps us then say to a local municipality, we know you care about these things, but you probably want to understand how to work as smartly as possible. So I think Eric and others, the hope here is this is just another tool for people to be able to think about how can they work in the most sophisticated way possible, knowing that these are all things that can have tremendous benefits if we keep an eye on them and we do them in a focused, smart way.
Thanks everyone for joining us on this webinar, the ecological value of Ontario's Greenbelt. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Andrés. Thank you, Edward, for offering your comments on the research report. And thank you, of course, to the authors of the research report. Thank you, Peri Dworatzek. Thank you, Bumika, Srikanthalingam. And then thank you, Kaitlin Powell. And with myself joining the research team, we are incredibly pleased with our results here in terms of our research, and happy to connect with any and all of you. You can reach us by emailing footprint@yorku.ca if you have any questions about this or would like any further applications, let's say even beyond. Thank you all very much. All the best to you.